I'd like to introduce the session, which is from the Voyageurs, which is a group of 17 Club of Rome and Association members, which have been joined by another 20 Club of Rome members. And we are worried about integrating positive sets of life experiences which have transformed into a positive future, such as we will hear after Bob Costanza and after Barry Hughes speaks on their integrative looks at the future. Bob, I don't think it needs a whole lot of introduction. He's been a leading influencer and thought leader. He is presently professor of ecological economics at the Institute for Global Prosperity at the University College in London. Before that, he was executive director of an institute in Australia for the CSIRO. Before that, he was a professor in several universities in the United States, and he has started several important journals for the kind of ecological economics which was so necessary 3 to 4 decades ago in order to comprehend what the true value of the environment and social services were. So I hand it over to you, Bob, and he's going to talk about two things: creating a sustainable well-being future and something about the Sustainable Development Goals at the UN, which is a purpose that we're all here at the UN for now. So, Bob, I hand it to you, and Ryan will put you on full screen.
Okay, thank you.
Ask the other people to mute themselves and put themselves mute their video and their audio, please, except Bob.
All right, thank you, Anitra. So I think you're all there and elsewhere around the world, thinking about how to create a sustainable well-being future and what does that actually mean and how do we get there. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. We all know, I think, that we're in a whole new geologic event, at least the Anthropocene, because of the magnitude of human influence on our ecological life support system. You know, we're in now a full world, as Herman Daly has called it. I think this means that business as usual is no longer an option. If we really want to create this sustainable and desirable Anthropocene, we need to think and act, I think, quite differently. But it's also an opportunity because the time is really now to build economies and societies that are based on a different goal, on the goal of sustainable well-being of humans and the rest of nature. And I think that's important to think of it that way. We're in this together. It's not humans and nature separate things, but humans and the rest of nature as an integrated system, rather than the goal we have been pursuing, which has been the single-minded pursuit of GDP growth, as if that was going to solve all of our problems. So to create sustainable well-being, I think we need these 3 elements to be integrated. First of all, to have an adequate vision of how the world is, our scientific understanding, which has certainly been improving over recent times, with understanding of how the Earth system functions as a complex system, but also understanding what contributes to human well-being, the whole field of positive psychology and other approaches that show that, you know, it's much more than simply the more we consume, the better off we are. And so that integrating all of that understanding, I think, is the challenge, however, and creating a more transdisciplinary understanding of how the world works, but also developing an adequate vision of how we would like the world to be, or a shared vision of how we would like the world to be. And I think that's what this session is largely about. How do we create that shared vision? How do we use it to motivate the kind of changes that we need? We also need tools and analytical techniques that are better integrated with this vision. And I think that requires systems thinking and modeling, as we'll hear about, I think, in the rest of the session. But we also need implementation strategies, I think, that are quite different as well, with new kinds of institutions that can better handle real deliberative democracy, that can better handle managing our common assets going forward, like our natural and social capital in particular. And also, I think we need some societal therapy to help overcome the lock-in or the addiction that we have to the current system, and part of the reason that we're not making faster progress. So we know the world is a complex, nonlinear, adaptive system. There are thresholds, there are tipping points, there are surprises. We can no longer think of it as something that progresses gradually. This is just a plot from one of Tim Lenton's papers, that goes beyond, oops, sorry, I went back the wrong way. Beyond the just the melting of the ice sheets, there's a whole range of different potential tipping points, and we're beginning to see or get close to some of those tipping points now. And that's, I think, what the whole planetary boundaries exercise has been about. How do we stay away from those tipping points? What's the safe operating space? And where are we relative to that safe operating space? And there have been several versions of this idea that have come out since 2009, at least. This is one from 2015 that shows, that we're outside that safe operating space for climate, for biodiversity, for land use change, for biogeochemical flows, et cetera. This is the most recent version, I think, that showed that we're outside 6 of these 9 planetary boundaries, and novel entities have been added, and climate change is certainly still there, but freshwater, land use systems, biogeochemical flows are also there. So what do we do about that? Well, we know that we are close to a major tipping point. This is from one of the late, great Will Steffen's papers, showing that we are potentially headed to a hothouse Earth scenario. And so our challenge really is to make this transition to a more stabilized Earth. So that's all stuff that we know, and I think the science is fairly clear. But unfortunately, that's not the movie that a lot of people are lining up to go see. That's an inconvenient truth. And because of that, we're not making, I think, as much progress as we could. And to overcome that, I think we need a third movie. We need a more positive vision of and narrative about what a sustainable and desirable world, economy, in society, in the rest of nature could look like, and recognize that interdependence, and try to understand how this whole system functions as a integrated system. So how do we create that movie? Well, we know we have to stay within planetary boundaries, but we also need to create the elements of quality of life, of well-being, et cetera, for people on the planet. We need to stay within what Kate Raworth has called the safe and just donut. And I think that way of framing this issue is pretty clear for many people. How do we do that? I think we also need a new approach, a new paradigm to how we think about the economy, and what the economy is for, and how to manage this integrated system. I think that's what ecological economics has been about for the last several decades, around these 3 integrated questions or goals. First of all, having an ecologically sustainable scale, staying within planetary boundaries, I think, is one of the main issues, and certainly that's a priority issue if we hope to maintain our position on this planet. Second, having a socially fair distribution of wealth and resources, both within the current generation, but between the current and future generations, the kind of classic definition of sustainability, but also between humans and other species. How do we manage the allocation of that wealth and resources? And how do we create a more economically efficient allocation of those resources that goes beyond the market system, which does not cover many of and should not cover, actually, many of the things that do contribute to our well-being, like our natural and social capital assets. And there are many different ways of talking about these issues, and I think they all overlap to quite a significant extent. Whether we're talking about the donut economy, or the ecological economy, or the well-being economy, because I think that's can be one of the ways of describing our fundamental goals: a circular bioeconomy, the regenerative economy, the steady state economy. I think all of these are quite similar in their fundamental goals, and quite similar in the kinds of policies and ideas that they that they espouse. So we don't want to get confused and think that they're all different things that we need to choose between. But let's go back a second and think about what is the empty world vision. What is it that we're trying to overcome? And this is the classic kind of model of the empty world. We have the primary factors of production: land, labor, and capital. You can see that land is kind of grayed out here because there's there's an assumption of almost perfect substitutability between these factors. You don't really need land or natural resources. You just need more capital, more built capital, more labor to produce marketed goods and services. That is all the GDP is measuring, is marketed goods and services that are either consumed in the current period or invested to build more capital in the next period. And welfare or utility is largely a function of how much we consume. And the property rights regimes are quite simplified into public and private. So the basic premises of this model are: more is always better. GDP is a good proxy for national welfare. The economy can grow forever. The scale is not an issue. Planetary boundaries is not an issue. There's nothing in this model that would limit the growth of GDP to infinity, and that's kind of the underlying goal. Poverty can best be solved with more growth. Just make the pie bigger, and we don't have to worry about how it's distributed. Nature is kind of a sideshow in this issue, in this vision, because of the substitutability factor. And private property is always best because there's we're really worried mainly about private goods and services that contribute to GDP. All right, so what's wrong with that model, and what kind of model do we really need going forward in this full world? First of all, we need to recognize that these four basic types of assets or capital are all required in a more balanced way, and that have only limited substitutability between them. That include our conventional built capital, human capital, not just labor, but individual people and all of their characteristics and their health and their well-being and their intelligence, but also social capital, all of the interactions among people, all of our cultures and our governments and our formal and informal networks, everything that connects people together. And finally, our natural capital, everything else in the system that we didn't have to produce, the natural world. And that those things contribute to conventional production and consumption of goods and services, but they also contribute to a much broader conception of well-being that has to do with a range of different inputs in addition to just consumption and production. So, and recognize that we live in a materially closed system and everything has to go somewhere. So what do we mean by quality of life or well-being in this broader conception, at least for humans? There has been a lot of research recently on this idea of subjective well-being. If you ask people in surveys, how satisfied are you with your life, all things considered, or various aspects of it. And that tends to depend on a whole range of basic human needs that have been defined going back to Maslow and more recently Amartya Sen and Barbara Nussbaum, that it includes things like subsistence and consumption, but it also includes a whole range of other things that actually contribute to people's well-being, their participation in communities, and the contributions of the natural and social capital. What we can do to meet those needs, I think, is to create, and the opportunities for that have to do with how we manage our assets, our built, our human, our social, and our natural capital, and how we manage our time. So this more complex view of all of the things that contribute to human well-being, I think, is something we need to take on board. And I think that this idea transcends individual humans or groups of humans, and I think it transcends the whole system. So one of the books that we published recently had to do with trying to create a more integrated science of well-being, all the way from individuals to communities to countries to the entire planet. How do we think of this as a systems problem, and what characteristics really contribute to well-being at many different scales. And one of the major ones that has been underappreciated in the past, at least, is this idea of ecosystem services. What is our natural capital contributing to this broad range of contributors to constituents of well-being that I just mentioned? And this is from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment from several years ago, which categorized them into these 4 basic categories of provisioning services like food and water, but also regulating services like climate regulation and storm protection and flood regulation, cultural services like recreational and aesthetic and spiritual ones, and supporting services that underlie all of these, and how they're connected to these various constituents of well-being. There is, I think, a missing element in this, or interaction in this diagram, and that's the interaction with the other 3 forms of capital that I mentioned. That natural capital just doesn't flow directly into sustainable human well-being. It needs to interact with these other 3 types of capital assets in complex ways, in different places, in space and time. And I think that's our challenge in trying to understand what sustainable human well-being is and how to produce it. How do these different elements interact? It's not enough to have only natural capital. We have to have individual people. We have to have some built infrastructure. We have to have some community, and how those things interact in the most optimal way, I think, is what we're trying to understand going forward. There's been a lot of interest in this idea of ecosystem services going forward. Most recently, the IPBES, the sort of biodiversity and ecosystem services equivalent to the IPCC, has been very active in this space and doing regular assessments of the status and trends of ecosystem services. I'm happy to report that just this year, IPBES and myself are both co-winners of the Blue Planet Prize, which is another recognition, I think, of the importance of this idea of ecosystem services going forward. There's a large global community of scholars and researchers and practitioners that are working on these ideas around the ecosystem services partnership. So if you're interested in learning more about that, take a look at their website and some of the meetings going forward. The academic interest in ecosystem services has been growing rapidly. This is a plot of the number of papers published in Scopus on this topic of ecosystem services, more than 6,000 a year now, and almost 60,000 papers total. The most highly cited of those is this one we did back in 1997, where we tried to estimate conservatively the total value of 17 ecosystem services across 16 different biomes, a meta-analysis of what we knew at the time about the values of these services, and we came up with an estimate that was significantly larger than global GDP at the time. So I think this kicked off, I think, a lot of interest just by showing how important, in terms that could be compared with other things that contribute to well-being, ecosystem services were. We got the cover of the journal, fortunately, but we didn't control what they put on the cover, and they said pricing the planet, and we really meant valuing the planet, and I think that distinction is really important as well. This is not simply trying to create marketed goods and services, but it's really trying to understand the contribution to well-being, but to express that contribution in terms that can be compared and understood with other things, like and certainly monetary units are one way of doing that. Not the only way, but certainly one important way. And there are many uses for this idea of valuing ecosystem services, including just raising awareness and interest, which I think was the major goal and result of the Nature paper, but also changing national income and well-being accounts. How do we include the contribution of ecosystems and their services to our accounting networks that drive a lot of policy decisions? We could use these kinds of analyses for specific policy analysis for urban and regional land use planning to underlie this idea of payment for ecosystem services, or how do we give financial incentives for producing these kinds of public goods that ecosystem services represent. We could use them for full cost accounting. What are the damages to these ecosystem services that the market is not telling us about? The markets don't tell us the true cost of everything that we're consuming, and we could include that cost, and I think it would change our consumption patterns quite dramatically. And finally, this idea of common asset trusts. How do we motivate the management of these systems for the good of the overall asset, rather than to extract things from them. So this is just something that's happening recently. For example, that Australia is now implementing some of the SEA recommendations, the System of Environmental and Economic Accounts. They'll be measuring the ecosystem services of the whole country, on a routine basis, and trying to incorporate that into the national income accounts going forward. And I think there are several other countries that are also doing something similar, including the United States. And there's been, as I said, a whole lot of additional research in this area. This is from a paper showing the range of values that have been estimated for this range of different ecosystems across the world. This was back in 2012. There's an online database called the Ecosystem Services Valuation Database that's open access, and it now has more than 10,000 individual estimates of individual services and individual ecosystems that one could use to do analyses of how this valuation is currently assessed and how it changes. We use some of that data in this report that looked at how these values had changed from 1997 until 2014, and found that in fact we're losing about $20 trillion worth of ecosystem services per year, largely because of land use change from deforestation, desertification, loss of coral reefs, et cetera. And that's had been leading to this loss in value. I think this may have moderated, and we're doing an update of this study now to try and find out where we are in the last 10 years. But going forward, in the longer term, we've also done some scenario analysis to look at what could happen, under conventional market forces, kind of business as usual management style, and that would lead to continuing loss of ecosystem services. We could arrest that and try to maintain where we are roughly, but we could also pursue the Great Transition Initiative, as it's been called, and go into active restoration and conservation of ecosystems and their services. And I think there are many UN policies, particularly around the biodiversity 30 by 30, policies that are headed in this direction. And so it'll be it's hopeful to think that we can be on this track of the Great Transition. So that's the natural capital side of the story, but there's also the social capital side of the story. And we have to recognize that social capital is highly dependent on how income is distributed. And this is from a book by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, The Spirit Level, from a few years ago, showing that the higher the income inequality by country, at least in OECD countries, the higher a whole range of social problems were. And so the ability to build social capital that contributes to sustainable well-being is highly dependent on how income is distributed, and also other factors that have to do with how societies are organized. We know that GDP does not capture much of that, and you've probably seen graphs of this nature in some form, that as GDP per capita increases, life satisfaction or other measures of well-being go up initially quite quickly, but then level off, and there's sort of a diminishing returns kind of function that comes into play. So do we really need all of this GDP per capita in order to have high levels of life satisfaction or well-being? I think the answer is probably no, but we need to have that GDP much better distributed to reduce inequality, like in some of the low income inequality countries. and we need to have it deal much better with natural capital. And of course, you know, or you should know that GDP was never designed as a measure of societal well-being. It's a quote from Simon Kuznets, one of the architects of GDP, that it really should not be used as a measure of welfare or well-being. That if you're talking about, you know, goals of more growth, you have to specify of what and for what. And I think what we really want is growth or improvement in well-being, but not necessarily growth in material consumption, in depletion of natural resources, in things that move us outside the planetary boundaries, et cetera. So it's well past time, I think, to leave GDP behind as our primary social goal. And I think there's growing recognition about that fact. And I think the challenge now is, well, what do we replace GDP with? How do we assess our progress? And how do we define our goals? Because these two things, I think, are highly interrelated. And this is a selection of a subset of some of the alternatives, and there have been many, as I'll show. But they fall into these three categories of things that are somehow modifying GDP, like the genuine progress indicator. I'll talk a little bit more about that. There are things that try to assess through surveys some idea of well-being, including Bhutan's Gross National Happiness Survey, the World Values Survey, the World Happiness Report. I think all of these things ask that question directly: how satisfied are you with your life? And then there's a whole range of alternatives that are indices that are built up from a range of different questions or components of the system, including the Human Development Index, one of the first of them, but things like the OECD Better Life Index is a more recent one that has a broader range of factors that they include in their index and their assessment of well-being. Just to give you one example, I think that shows some quite compelling results, is the Genuine Progress Indicator, or it used to be called the Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare, originally created by Herman Daly and John Cobb back in 1989. But includes personal consumption expenditures, which are a major component of GDP, but then it weights those by income distribution to get at this distinction between income and welfare, and to get at the relationship between wealth distribution and well-being in society. It adds a few things that are left out of GDP, like household labor and volunteer work, you know, good things that are not marketed, so they're not included. And it subtracts a bunch of things that really shouldn't be counted as positives, even though GDP does include them in that way: the cost of water and air pollution, and loss of wetlands, and climate change, et cetera, loss of leisure time, and crime. So that cover all four of these types of capital that I mentioned before. What do you get when you apply this measure? Well, we did a global assessment or meta-analysis. It's been a while now, but anyway, I don't think things have changed that much. You get that, you know, from the post-war period up until roughly the present, GDP per capita has been increasing quite steadily. But GPI, genuine progress, tracked that for a while, and only until about 1980, at which point increasing inequality, increasing environmental damage, and other negative factors have led to a stagnation or decline in genuine progress. So we've moved from a period of what Herman Daly has called true economic growth to a period of uneconomic growth. The economy is growing, but it's not really producing increased welfare when you take these negative side effects into account. And the size of this distinction between GDP per capita and genuine progress is one measure of how addicted we are to this GDP growth at all costs kind of paradigm. Recently, we had a class where we tried to assess, well, how many of these alternative indicators really are out there, because there are a lot, and we were surprised to find that there's more than 400 of them that have been proposed in different countries by different organizations around the world at different scales, et cetera. And so one of our hypotheses was that yes, there are lots of them, but they all do overlap quite a bit. They're all saying many of the same things, and that we're really not going to be able to move beyond GDP until we build some broader consensus around these alternative indicators, especially if they are quite similar. This is from some work in progress where we tried to do just that. We tried to take all 400 of those alternative indicators and use some semantic modeling techniques and say, well, how similar are they all? Which ones actually capture most of the things that are included in these alternative indicators, depending on how many indicators you use. And you can see that there is a diminishing returns quite type of relationship there. And I think this is important going forward and in terms of how many indicators are really needed to identify or to measure well-being at different scales. And so, there seems to be a break point at around 20, where beyond 20, it doesn't increase all that much. But certainly before 20, you get quite a steep increase. And here's some of the existing indicators that are sort of in that range. So Canada's quality of life framework, for example, happens to have 19 components, and it has quite a good similarity index in our modeling thing. So you can use this kind of information, I think, to help design indicator sets that do satisfy a range of different conditions and that cover all of the things that people need, that we think need to be included in these measures of societal well-being. I'm part of a current project funded by the European Union called MERGE, which is an effort to do just that, to sort of put these synthesize what's been done in the metrics and indicator space, but also in the integrated modeling space and in the policy space, and try to come up with an integrated system of metrics, models, and policies that support the societal goal of sustainable and inclusive well-being, as opposed to the current system, which includes the models and metrics. Well, GDP is a primary metric, and it's supported by the classic input-output and system of national accounts kinds of models, which are linear and static in their fundamental outlook, and the policies that support that. So how do we change from this system to this broader system? And I think the hypothesis is that we need to have all three of these elements really in an integrated way, not just any one of them independently. So we're working on that as part of this project. I think you may have seen, I gave Anitra this paper that recently was published in collaboration with the United Nations Institute for Training and Research and other United Nations elements, and the PAGE project, about building this shared vision that's needed for a green and fair economic transformation. How do we make that transition from the current system to the one that we're looking for? And certainly it's going to require sharing the burden fairly. We have to take inequality much more seriously into account. There's issues about the finance gap and how do we overcome the current financial architecture at the world level. But I think a key one there is how do we create a shared vision of where we're trying to go, what we're trying to achieve. And I think that leads to my final part of this, which is that part of the reason that we haven't made as much progress as we could is that we are locked in or addicted to this current paradigm. There are a lot of positive feedback loops. There are a lot of interest groups that benefit from the current system, including the fossil fuel sector, and the current arrangement of the inequality among countries. So how do we break that addiction? And a key step in that therapy, by analogy with breaking individual addictions, is building this shared vision of what the sustainable and desirable future that focuses on the well-being of all humans and the rest of nature. How do we build that shared vision? Well, one little bit of research that we did was to ask, well, what can we learn from what works to overcome addictions at the individual scale to overcoming these societal addictions? You know, are there techniques that we might borrow or scale up that might help us? And it turns out that there's one therapy called motivational interviewing that seems to be quite effective. And what it does is, instead of confronting addicts with their problem, it engages them in a positive discussion of their goals, their motives, their futures. What are they trying to get out of their life? And use that positive vision of their life to motivate then the difficult changes that they're going to need to make in order to overcome their addiction. And they are difficult. I think the obvious analogy at the societal scale is, well, how do we create a shared societal vision of the kind of world that we want? And I think that's where the SDGs are a major step in that direction. You know, the first time really in human history that all countries in the world have agreed to this broader set of goals that I think encapsulate many, if not most, of the elements that go into a definition of a well-being, a sustainable well-being society. I'm not going to go over these. You all know, I'm sure, the SDGs. I think one thing that we need to do, though, is to understand the synergies and trade-offs, you know, among those different goals, the 17 goals, and how they contribute to the broader overarching goal of a sustainable and inclusive well-being society, and the sub-goals of sustainable scale, staying within planetary boundaries, fair distribution, and efficient allocation. So understanding the dynamics of this system, I think, is a real challenge. And I think that's where we need some better, more integrated, dynamic modeling kinds of approaches. And one way also to look at the future and whether we can achieve these goals is to think of it as from a scenario planning perspective. What are the possible futures? What are plausible futures going forward? This is from the Great Transition Initiative scenarios, which I think are fairly typical, archetypical of the kinds of scenarios that one can think about going forward. You know, a business as usual scenario, a policy reform scenario, both of which are still focused on GDP growth, but also there can be a great transition scenario that's more focused on the community and well-being and the kinds of things that we're talking about, polycentric governance, stewardship rather than market competition. We're all in this together kind of thing. I think the SDGs fit much more comfortably into that kind of future scenario. But how do we communicate that? How do we get this scenario, this shared vision, you know, out of the policy community and into the general public, and get some discussion about alternative futures? And certainly, this is not what's happening in the political sphere. You know, people are not thinking that far in the future, and that's part of the problem, you know, with overcoming this societal addiction. We have to get people to think about the more distant future and what a good future could look like. And one way to do that is to compare the possible alternatives, but in ways that can engage people and can engage the public. So just doing a set of bullet points is really not going to be enough. I think you're going to need some visuals, you're going to need some videos, you're going to need some other kinds of, you know, immersive game playing, perhaps. You know, I think it's a real open area for the kinds of techniques that we could use to engage the public in thinking about alternative futures. One thing that we've done is try to do public opinion surveys of alternative futures. We did this one in Australia, where we basically used those 4 scenarios, changing the names slightly, just to overcome what people thought were too value laden in terms of the terminology. So instead of the Great Transition, which who could be against that, it's more about community well-being versus free enterprise versus coordinated action versus strong individualism on this set of axes. And the results that we got from that survey for 2,000 sort of representative sample of the country looked something like this, where the community well-being was by far the most highly preferred or ranked first or second in the by 72% of the population. Not that everybody wanted that vision, but it was definitely one that was much more highly preferred, I think, than people would have otherwise recognized. We also asked people, which scenario they thought the country was headed toward, and by a large margin, they said the business as usual kind of free enterprise system. So, and I think you get that result in many different situations where the kind of future that people want is not the one that they think we are headed toward. And so how to manifest, how to use that that information about what kind of future, what our goals are for the future as a society to motivate the kind of changes that we need to happen. This is another set of surveys that was done across a range of different countries with a slightly simpler set of scenarios. There were just two scenarios. One was the kind of business as usual one, and one was the more sustainable scenario, very similar in characteristics, I think, to the ones we're talking about for the Great Transition. And you can see that by a large margin in all of these countries, that the sustainable scenario was much more desirable. They asked people a slightly different version of the question. They said, how desirable, do you think it would be to have that kind of future? Much more desirable than the business as usual scenario in all countries, with some interesting variations between countries. Of course, the Earth for All study that the Club of Rome has done, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, also did a couple of scenarios and has done the underlying modeling to look at how those scenarios could manifest themselves going forward. And there's more recently, there's the survey that about Earth for All that recently was published. I'm not sure if you've seen these results, but they're quite an elaborate set of results that ask questions like, in this case, there is support in the G20 countries anyway for well-being economies among those surveyed. They asked the question, the way the economy works should prioritize the health and well-being of people and nature rather than focusing solely on profit and increasing wealth. So you get 68% of the population either strongly or tend to agree with that kind of statement. Oops. Likewise, the economic success of the country should be measured by the health and well-being, not how fast the economy is growing. So this idea of the goal should be a well-being economy, a sustainable well-being economy, rather than simply an economy that's growing as quickly as possible is fairly well supported by the current population in the OECD countries at least. So I think a lot of that then argues for the need to make this transition and how we measure the progress toward this goal. What do we mean by a sustainable well-being economy? And I think that has to do with how we build this shared vision and a shared set of metrics or indicators for whether we're making progress. What are the elements that are included in that? And I think there is some progress going on in that regard. But beyond that, I think we need to develop some new kinds of institutions to manage our set of assets in a way that can help us get to these goals that we're talking about. And I think one kind of institution that we need is one that's more about managing common assets, be a common asset trust or other means where we're really talking about how do we steward these assets in a way that maintains and enhances their value going forward. Based on some of the ideas of Elinor Ostrom, who has developed a set of design principles for managing the commons that could be incorporated into new kinds of institutions at multiple scales, including at the atmospheric scale. And we've proposed that one way that we could move forward with the climate change agenda is to develop an atmospheric trust and to think of the atmosphere as being an asset that we all own together, and then under the public trust doctrine, and that the legal institutions surrounding property rights, can then be used to to charge for damages to that asset to the 90 entities in the world that are responsible for 2/3 of the carbon emissions, the fossil fuel sector, essentially, and use those funds, put those funds into a trust that could then be used to undo the damages to the extent possible through reclamation, through carbon sequestration projects, planting trees, restoring wetlands, etc. But also by trying to achieve some of the other SDGs and reducing poverty and increasing education, etc. So it's an idea I think that we could apply to managing the atmospheric commons. I think we could do something similar with the marine commons as well, and also commons at other scales like watersheds. But ultimately, I think it's going to take a larger movement, a movement of movements. And one group that's trying to build that movement is the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, who some of you may be already associated with. And I certainly the Club of Rome, and we all are highly interconnected. And there's a subgroup of the Wellbeing Economy governments, and there's a great TED talk by Nicola Sturgeon, if you haven't watched it, that talks about why governments need to take well-being on as their primary policy goal, rather than continuing with GDP. So you could take a look at the We All website if you haven't already, and join this group that's trying to build this larger movement around all of the individuals and institutions and groups that are headed in the same direction, but need to be, I think, more allied and more integrated in order to build the critical mass necessary, I think, to overcome the special interests and others that are certainly going to stand in the way. I'll end it with a plug for some books that go into more detail in all of the things I've been talking about, including this most recent one and this one about toward an integrated science of well-being, and also about the agenda for ecological economics toward sustainable well-being futures. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Brilliant, as usual, and congratulations from all of us on your prize. Richly deserved, and I suppose the next prize will be the Nobel. You count on me for writing a backup letter for that one. Would you entertain a few questions?
Sure. Yeah. Let me stop
right.
sharing. Stop sharing the screen.
Questions?
Yeah.
Ted?
Yeah,
Ted, this is Ted Manning, who's the head of
we've met once or twice before.
Canadian Club of Rome. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I worked with Rudolph and groups many years ago when we were first coming up with the idea of environmental functions. So I'm delighted to see how this has been advancing. I very much like your structure. We come at it in a different way through the Club of Rome group on well-being. But for the same reasons, which is trying to replace the way we fool ourselves about what our goals really are. And I'd just like to add that the group that we have here, some of them are here: David Pollock, Van Huston, Marilyn Mosley-Gordanier, John Gilmour, among others, been working to try and empirically define what well-being might mean to other people around the world. And we have come at it from the other way, which is essentially asking small communities around the world, groups and so on, what they really want, what they see as their life, what they would really like to see as a model for their own lifestyles. And we have a long list of those that we can't make available through this group at some point in the future. We will be making a presentation covering some of this in Brussels if you're there. But we're really on the same mission, which is to try and change the world one decision at a time. So I'd just like to say I was very pleased with the way you did this, the way you've been pulling so many things together, and very also impressed with the number of different sources you have brought in to try and bring this all together. So it is both understandable and hopefully saleable.
Yeah.
So again, thank you very much, and I hope we will be able to work with you further in this initiative we're doing with several of the other people in Rome.
Is there a question in all that?
No, I don't have any questions. You answered them all already. I guess.
Maybe I could turn it into a question or
Yeah,
answer
please
something.
do, yeah.
Well, when you do these surveys of what people want, I think it fits into that spectrum, of metrics that people have
Yeah.
come up with, because some of them were developed in the same way. And
Right.
so I think the danger there is that, people begin to think, well, that each one of them is somehow different from all of the others. And we have some unique, when in fact, I think the experience has been that they overlap, significantly. And
Oh, yeah.
so it may not be, it may not be helpful to try to make them appear different as much as it would be helpful to show how similar they are, and that everyone around the world wants some basic things. Now they're going to have, access to those things at different levels depending on where they are, and so it may mean that they need to improve, different aspects in different places for different reasons. But I think making the point that there are a set of basic human needs, and I think there are things that contribute to people's well-being that we can generalize, and that we can use that generalization to move the ball forward, because that's kind of how GDP sort of came about. They said, well, everybody needs food and shelter and all of that, and so certainly that's a shared goal. That has been driving a lot of policy. We need to just broaden that goal and say, what is it?
Can we actually apply it? I know a lot of us have been working at a very local scale with a small community or a school or a community that's in peril in some way, developing their own indicators, sets of metrics. And I've been doing it mainly in the tourism sector. But the whole idea was it was so much easier to apply at the level of a small community or a single entity. How do we scale it up? How do we make a big difference?
Yeah. Okay. Next question.
John Gilmour, who's online, would you like to ask Bob a question?
Bob, thank you very much for that incredible overview of so much. You have a beautiful gift of pulling things together and making them very clear. I'd like to just say, as one who lives on the continent of Africa, didn't hear a lot of African analysis in that presentation, so I would like you to comment on whether you think there is a further complication to the coherence of the issue when we live in a continent where in 2050, 1 in 4 people on the world surface are going to be African, and of that 1 in 4, 1 in 8 will be at school. So my work is education. I'm interested in Donella Meadows' ideas around leveraging change through the personal rather than through the political or through the structured. And so we're working with the idea of addiction to internalized poverty, addiction to internalized oppression. And in our schools, we are working with what is the paradigm shift required in the pedagogy that must move from a kind of transmission pedagogy to a self-liberating pedagogy. So I'd be interested in the African overview from your point of view, whether you think there is an omission there or whether it's just a further complication. And then also in the microspace that Ted talks about, this work has to translate into a third movie. And the third movie for me is No One's Coming to Rescue You. Self-liberation is the narrative. We have to free ourselves with a common vision of a new world and a new Africa and a new reclamation of the heritage.
Yeah, well, I think this idea of a shared vision is something that needs to be at multiple scales, certainly, but I think it needs to be at the global scale as well. And the idea that, in particular, we need a vision of a new development paradigm, that this idea that, African countries should be trying to catch up with, the global north and reproduce the same development path that the north has done. I think that's the mistake. They
I
need
agree
to
with that.
develop a new goal and a new development paradigm of what does development mean. And I think that gets back to the vision. What kind of world are you trying to create, and how much progress are you making toward that goal? That's what development should be. So, and that if that goal is not GDP growth, then it's going to be a whole different set of policies, a whole different set of ideas, and and it's going to depend on where you're starting from as well, which is going to be quite different for the African situation than it is for many other countries. But still, I think the goals are probably more highly shared than we give credit for. But the strategy and implementation is going to vary. And it's important to make it clear that the goal is different from the one that we've been pursuing.
Now,
David Pollock
yeah.
from Canada, please ask your question.
Thank you, Robert. That was superb, and I could spend 4 or 5 hours with you in conversation. I helped to develop some early work in Canada on the Genuine Progress Index
Okay.
a little more
Yeah.
later. But as the years go by and I look at the kind of overshoot situation we're in, the climate, the kind of planetary boundaries that you referenced, and how great that risk is in a number of those, I'm wondering if there's been much thought given to the development of what I might call existential indicators. The 5 or 6 or 8 that we really need to work on most as societies, so that we have a framework for survival that allows the wider work of well-being to go forward. And in keeping with that question, I'm just wondering, do things like the growth of the global population factor into much of the well-being thinking that you've been doing? I'm really concerned about the whole setup of overshoot and how we try to move forward along the lines you're describing with well-being in that wider context. So any further comment?
Yeah, well, it's interesting that population is leveling off, and I think it's interesting that you see many commentators saying, "Oh, this is a disaster. We need to get back into population growth," simply because population growth and GDP growth, kind of go hand in hand. So I think if we change the development goal to a sustainable well-being economy, a steady state economy, if you will, or at least, or even a slightly degrowing economy, then I think that changes the whole perspective about what we're doing with population. That's a good thing. It's a good thing that population is leveling off. That sort of makes the problem that much easier. If our goal is not to keep growing, but our goal is to improve things. And I think that takes, and if you can take growth off the table, and I think this is, the analogy is, when you're a teenager and you're growing physically, like crazy, that creates a lot of problems that you can sort of get over once you become a mature adult, and you can start focusing on other things. So once we, stop worrying about growth, we can start worrying about how to distribute the wealth. We can start worrying about how to reduce our environmental impacts. We can start worrying about how to make the system better rather than how to make the system bigger. So I think it's all interconnected in that way, and that's yeah. And I think we do need to think about what's stopping us. And I think one of the most critical, you talked about what were the most critical ones, and existential ones. Certainly climate, I think, is probably the one that's at the top of the agenda these days. And I think we need to start going after the real causes of what's slowing us down right now, which is the fossil fuel sector, which we continue to subsidize, which they continue to use their enormous profits. They've spread misinformation and to buy politicians and et cetera. So I think as long as that's controlling what's happening, politically and economically, then we're not going to make progress as quickly as we really need to avoid that existential climate crisis. And I think if you took the fossil fuel sector sort of out of the picture, we could make that transition to renewable energy quickly enough. I think we could reduce consumption and you know, significantly enough to achieve our climate goals. I think that's what's really standing in the way. That's this you know, atmospheric trust idea, I think, is one potential way to get at specifically the fossil fuel sector, and to try to at least, you know, reduce their profitability to the point where they can't continue to have the kind of influence that is keeping us addicted to the current system.
Michael Dorsey has a question for you here in the room.
Hey, Bob, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, hi.
Great, great. Congrats for the award. Certainly well deserved. Just to sort of, I guess, two questions. The first.
How you doing, by the way? Yeah.
Good to see you, good to see you. The first, you know, just, I'm wondering where, I'm sort of looking forward to reading the two new papers that you referenced, but what's the new update 30 years on your data? You know, the global GDP was a third of where it is today when you did that paper way back when. So I'm wondering what the new is on the numbers. And then related to that, let's just stick it at your numbers at the, you know, roughly, you know, that was your, I think it was your average, that 33 trillion.
Yeah. I don't think that relationship has changed all that much. We had an update in 2014. I don't know if you saw that paper where, yeah, global GDP had increased, but also I think the value that we estimated for those services had also increased because of new research and new applications. So we're working on another update at the moment. So I could give you the answer to that maybe in a few months. Yeah, so I'll keep you posted, but regardless, I think it's important to recognize that, you know, that our natural capital assets, you know, are more significant, I think, and will continue to be more significant than our built and human capital assets taken together. And certainly it's not so much that we, you know, it's really how those assets interact with each other and how the system functions that I think is even more important. And I think that's where some of the systems modeling that's going on, like the Club of Rome modeling, and there's a whole initiative, you know, as part of this merge project that I was talking about, to build much more dynamic and integrated models that can underlie the metrics, because I think GDP has been so successful because it has this underlying model of the economy, that, you know, the sort of system of national accounts and the input-output model, but it's static, it's limited, you know, to just the market essentially. So we need a model that is accepted fairly broadly, but that includes the natural and the social capital and the dynamics in the system, and can really look at how these things interact and how they produce, you know, true well-being, not just more GDP. So I think all of those things are on the research agenda. Maybe Barry's going to talk about all of this.
Ted Manning had another question.
Yeah, I'm just going to instigate it for a minute. Everybody has agreed with you totally what we've been talking about and what is necessary. But now we're coming back to the people. How do we make that change happen? For example, are class action suits possible? Is there political uprising in our future? What would it take to instigate a rational change to something that would be much more livable for humanity on the planet?
Yeah. No, well, I've been thinking about that as what we need is a movement of movements, essentially, which is, you know, a civil society, critical mass of civil society to sort of manifest these kinds of changes. And I think that critical mass can be formed around this shared goal, you know, of the kind of world that we want, you know. So I think a lot, like I was saying, I think the vast majority of people on planet Earth, I think, would buy into that vision and say, yeah, that's the kind of world we want. We want a world that's, you know, less unequal, that's more sustainable in terms of the environment, that we dealt with climate change. I mean, all of those things are highly desirable, I think, by most people when they think about them, at least in the midterm. You know, I think what gets the problem is they're being asked questions about what to do next, you know, like who to vote for and what policy do they want to support, instead of being asked what kind of world do they want. And I think that's really should be the essence of democracy, should be to build the shared vision, not necessarily to you know, to decide what to do next in order to get there. And that's the political process that we have not been you know, implementing in our democracies. You know, we don't build the shared vision with people. We sort of assume that that's already there. You know, that GDP growth is the vision, and nobody challenges that. So we have to challenge that assumption and say, no, that's not the vision. The vision is something more like what we're talking about. And once you can establish that and get enough people behind that, then I think that can motivate the necessary changes. That's kind of the, you know, the motivational interviewing analogy, I think. Taken out
Thank
there.
you very much for your wonderful presentation. And we're very happy that you could join us on this action session to the UN summit. There's a great deal going on and people are rushing in and out. And there's a lot of excitement, especially around things like artificial intelligence, but also I think a certain amount about ecosystem sustainability and ecosystem regeneration. So thank you for this word of wisdom, and wonderful that you could have won this prize. And I hope it was a whole lot of happiness here. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.
And
right.
we're going to go on to Barry Hughes. You're welcome to stay and listen to his analysis in systems of the Sustainable Development Goals.
Okay.
Thank you. So
Anitra, thank you.
Barry. Hi, Barry. So Barry is one of my very favorite people in the world, and he was a close colleague of many people, including John Richardson, who I think is on the on this web call, and of course Mike Nasarovich at Case Western Reserve. And then Barry went on to start his own Institute for International Futures at the Corbell Center at the University of Denver, which is the Pardee Center and has been very successful. Barry has written a long series of books based on the international future, and of course a lot of papers, and has worked repeatedly for various UN agencies, including UNDP, World Bank, and I think FAO and UNEP. And Barry is now going to talk about his Sustainable Development Goals and how he sees them moving into the future, and how he integrated these various factors and what he thinks the future has in store. Thank you, Barry.
I'm going to jump into this, hopefully try to build on Bob Costanza a bit in the process, and get right into it here. I want to spend a little time looking under the hood, as I usually say, at the International Futures, or IF system. And the IFs is an acronym chosen because of the if-then character of our thinking about futures, alternative futures and scenarios. And we're going to focus with the International Future System on the SDGs in particular. And I should say the International Future System has roots going back, as Anitra was saying, to work that was done with John Richardson and Mike Nasarovich in the early to mid 1970s. So we've got about 50 years of experience under our belt on this work. So, but I need to tell you a bit about that as a foundation for the second topic, which is digging into scenario analysis with it, and focusing heavily on those SDGs. There are a couple of different kinds of scenarios we can do with ifs. One is the larger integrated alternative futures of the character of having 3 or 4 or 5 alternative global scenarios, but we can also drill down into more focused policy-related analysis, at least, by specific interventions, whether those are on education, health, renewable energy, quality of governance, and so on. And I'll be talking pretty significantly about that more focused policy analysis, as well as the larger integrated groupings of those interventions. And we'll focus today on the integrated base case as one scenario from IFS, and especially on what we call the SDG push scenario and its subset of more focused policy interventions. The SDG push scenario can be considered to be something like the Great Transition scenario that Bob was talking about. Unfortunately, there's a very easy answer to the question as to whether and when the SDGs will be met. In our base case, or the path we seem to be on analysis, very few of the SDG targets will be met by 2030. More definitely by 2050, but nowhere near the full range of the SDGs. Furthermore, as was suggested by the question concerning Africa, more clarity on this analysis calls for us to drill down geographically, regions of the world, countries of the world, and also temporally, and focus on a wide range of policy interventions. And then after that first 2 topics, I hope we have some time for some question and answers. This is the kind of image of where I'm going to be going with this discussion in part. We'll come back to this figure later on, but if we look at 2 different scenarios that we did actually with a UNEP group called the SDG integration team within the United Nations Development Program. We were asked to look at the difference between the path we had been on prior to COVID and the path we seem to be on now into and past, to a large degree, at least we hope, the COVID epidemic, and then this alternative SDG push scenario integration and the subset of interventions within it. The path we were on, we have been on now in what is now our base case scenario, the COVID world scenario, COVID and past world scenario. Let me go back, didn't mean to jump ahead there. The path we seem to be on would have led us by 2030 to not meet any of the major human development kinds of goals on a global basis. The extreme poverty goal, which is depending on the dollars we're using, 2015, 2017, 2005 dollars, etc. But in any case, we would not have, with those targets, have gone more than about 1/3 of the way between 2015 and the specific target for eliminating that extreme poverty in the COVID world. With the SDG push scenario that we'll be talking about, again, somewhat like the Great Transition scenario family, we would move further, close to half of the distance on a global basis. The only one of the indicators or target variables indicated around this particular diagram that we might well meet even in the SDG push scenario by 2030 is the neonatal mortality target, which is less than 12 per 1,000 live births. And that is on a global basis. So there would be many, many countries out there, and we'll talk about this more, that would not meet that goal, even under the SDG push scenario by 2030. If we look out to 2050, we begin to see considerably more of the targets that could be met by that time on a global basis again, but very probably not by a significant number of the individual countries. And then we also drill down quite often inside countries, and I'll talk a little bit about that. I need, as part of this topic one, giving you some information about the International Future System, to tell you a little bit about that system. We represent 188 countries individually and their interactions via trade, financial aid, and so on. Our forecast can extend routinely out to 2100, and we actually do some very small amount of analysis beyond that, which is important for this demographic question. What's going to happen as we move beyond stability potentially to some reduction in the global population size? But these units, these are all large-scale models within what I call the International Future System. It's more than a model. It's a system of hard-linked models. It has, in this first tier up here, a representation of demographics, obviously, but also of health. Our health model, we collaborated with individuals and World Health Organization, and now with the Global Burden of Disease Project, our education model, and I'll talk more about that. But these three models relate fairly clearly to the first 6 of the human development goals around poverty reduction, hunger elimination, health and well-being improvement, and so on. Then we have down here at this level representations of environmental change, including air quality, but also obviously climate change, buildup of atmospheric greenhouse gases. We also have a representation of agriculture, which is highly dependent upon land use and related to land use, and of energy, with clear distinctions between renewable and non-renewable energy sources. And those models within the IF system relate to another 5 of the goals, in particular around sustainable development. In between here, we have a number of models, including obviously economics, and that's a very large model in many respects, including social accounting matrices that show flows of finances across households, firms, the government, obviously, in various streams of governmental spending, these financial flows linked to that economics model. And these are important because when we intervene, we know there's no free lunch, in the sense that we can spend more on education and health, for instance, without somehow having those resources. They may come from the outside via financial assistance, but very often, obviously, they're going to need to be raised internally. There are trade-offs on those expenditures with what households can keep, firms can keep, and governmental expenditures in other areas. Technology and infrastructure representations are obviously fundamentally important in the quality of governance. So these are elements. Now, can somebody tell me, is my gallery of pictures here blocking the side of this screen?
No.
Oh, good. Okay. So 5 Ps is another way that some people look at this particular UN system: people, prosperity, partners, peace, and planet. As I think Bob was suggesting, I don't think he used the expression integrated assessment models, or IAMs, but there is a consortium globally, actually, of models that have largely come from the climate change and environmental side, and have usually lesser representations up in these higher levels that I'm showing you here. But the IAM models in the consortium, there's some really excellent work out there that's being done quantitatively, especially in Europe and in Asia, and also obviously in the United States. We are a special exemplar in a way because we have more representations and richer representations up in these levels, and we also routinely deal with 188 countries and sometimes their breakdowns, whereas many of these models are regional representations of the world, and again, don't have those other elements in them. Now, I'm going to jump over this, but I wanted it on the screen in case anybody is interested in following up. It's important to us, has been from the beginning of this effort, going back into the 1970s, as I was saying, and developing over time, to make this open source and fully available to anybody who wants to use it. All elements of it, the data, the model, and everything I'll be showing you today. You can go to just the Corbell School of International Studies and pick it up there. You can also and download it and use it on your own systems, or you can use it on the web at this address. There is extensive documentation on this because it's really important for everybody to know what the equations, what the database are, how these things relate to each other. And that's available inside the wiki of the model, and we have a Pardee system. This is called a Pardee Institute now for International Futures, and that has a lot of publications and documentations. Here are some of the groups with whom we currently work or have fairly recently worked with. I've emphasized the UN family. As Anitra was saying, we have been working with UNICEF, with UNEP now currently in the Global Environmental Outlook #7 in progress. We've worked directly with the UN Secretary General's office, with an organization within the UN called UN Women, and with a variety of institutions, sub-institutions within the UN Development Program, including some of the country-specific teams, some of the regional teams, and as I mentioned before, the SDG integration team focused specifically on analysis as to how we accelerate and improve our movement towards those SDG targets and goals. We've also worked quite actively with the African Union and its Development Administration, AUDA, with the European Commission, worked with U.S. Agency for International Development, including a number of country and regional teams. We're working right now with a group in the UK called Octopus on a renewable energy project. We've worked with a variety of national governments, well beyond just the names of Peru and Brazil here. We also publish widely. We need to be in the academic space as other organizations like us, including the work that Bob's group has been doing. We need to be in the academic space as well as the policy world and the organizations I just mentioned. We began with earlier in this decade with a series of volumes called Patterns of Potential Human Progress, focused on reducing global poverty, advancing education, improving global health, building infrastructure, enhancing governance nationally and globally. And these books are available on our website, available without any cost to anyone who might be interested. And some of these obviously precede the actual release of the SDG list. Here are articles that we published fairly recently in journals like Sustainability, World Development, Futures, World Development, oops. Let's try this again. And climatic change. So, and also a very large number of reports with various partner organizations. Now, let's jump into the scenario analysis and move into that topic #2. When you open up the International Futures system, and again, freely available on the web or to download, you see a screen like this. And this screen, with the map of the 188 countries that we represent, you can click on any of these countries and it calls up all kinds of data and forecast information about those countries individually. or you can work through the menu here to do a variety of analyses. And I want to talk just a little bit about three categories here. Data analysis. The database that accompanies this system has over 6,000 series now, drawn from a very wide range of international governmental organizations and research think tanks. Whenever possible, cover obviously all 188 of those countries when the data are available. We tried on this database to go back to 1960, and we have a significant data team within the center that is constantly updating this database. We employ about 80 graduate students at the University of Denver, and a significant number of those graduate students are part of our data team. Many people use this system simply for the data analysis. It allows inside the data analysis topic, when you drop that down, it allows cross-sectional and longitudinal analysis, a variety of statistical measures looking at the trends, looking at the relationships across variables. Those statistical systems are built into the data analysis topic here. Some people use the if system only for data analysis. They come to us because they want access to that data, and it's, again, freely available there. The display system we'll be looking at more today, and that allows us to look at a variety of graphical, tabular, and special display features. And then, very important, is the scenario analysis system, which allows us to change any variable's initial condition and any of the parameters in the model, and build scenarios around doing that. So let's continue on this and focus on that scenario analysis. If you touch on that scenario analysis option from the main menu, you see this drop-down list. And the one we probably use the most is this one called Quick Scenario Analysis with Tree. That opens up a tree here with multiple subcategories that you can expand, and allows you to make assumptions about technological change in these issue areas that vary across time, or environmental uncertainties. It also allows you to intervene at a more policy relevant level in terms of behavior of households, of the governments, and of firms and businesses, as well as changing initial conditions and relationship parameters. So that opens up access to scenario development very widely. But so widely that most people who use it are not going to be building their own scenarios. They're going to be looking at a list of scenarios that we have developed under this Add Scenario Components option, which, when you touch on that, shows you scenarios in various categories, whether it's education, energy, multi-factor productivity, for instance, the Nordhaus carbon tax scenarios. Today, we're going to be looking at SDG push and decomposed push scenarios under this particular category. But scenarios have been developed with our partners and by our partners, by ourselves, across many, many categories. The decomposed SDG push scenario, which helps illustrate I wouldn't actually call it policy analysis, because it's at a bit too high an integrated level for that. It's policy focal points to some considerable degree, but we'll talk more about that or illustrate that as we go forward. Oops, I'm using a keypad today rather than a mouse, which I left back in Denver, and I'm not so good at the keypad as I would like to be. But the agriculture and calorie availability element of the integrated SDG push scenario involves focus on things like increasing yields, reducing agricultural losses, increasing calorie availability, also changing its distribution across populations. In education, we have aspects of increasing enrollment and completion at different levels of education, enhancing STEM, focus on spending more on education. Within health, cook stoves, improved cook stoves, reducing ambient air pollution. Water and sanitation, we use the 5 category ladders to try to move from open defecation and unsafe water to highly improved on both of those categories, and so on down here, including things like the character of governance, advancing democracy, reducing corruption. Wage equality for women. We had a special project with the UN Women Group on that issue, obviously around climate change, advancing renewable technology, improving energy usage efficiency, perhaps a direct carbon tax in terms of its implications, reforestation. All of these elements, and they're elaborated in that SDG push scenario. This is an overview really of what's under that hood, but all of these are available individually, by category, by individual action, or all together. And we'll need to talk a little bit about trade-offs and synergies across some of these categories, obviously. Okay. When you go from scenario analysis to display, you have options that include flexible displays of various kinds. We'll see some of those. Self-managed display, which opens up every variable and every parameter in the model for every geographic unit across any time horizon you choose. And then a number of specialized displays. And I'll show you, for instance, in a little while here, short time, population by age and sex, education by age, health by age and sex. But the SDG overview table is one that some of you might be interested in, as you might be interested in the SDG graph option. This SDG overview table I find personally rather overwhelming, because it has, for each of the 17 goals, a list of the targets and indicators, and it has values in a recent year. Actually, right here, that's showing 2020. Oops, here I go again. 2020, our current base year. It shows values out to 2060 in a reference scenario, the base scenario, and then in intervention scenarios. And it's overwhelming. We're trying to somewhat simplify this, actually, almost as I talk today. That's, however, these things that I've showed you, the scenario analysis and the looking at all these various targets and variables, is what leads to the kind of graphics that I was showing you a little while ago. Now, what goals and targets will be reached globally by 2030 or 2050? This comes from an article that was published fairly recently, and it's not, I mean, dealing with reaching goals and targets within the SDGs is very complicated for a variety of reasons. One of them is that each individual goal has typically about 8 to 12 targets associated with them, and which ones do you use, which ones do you don't. That's why that messy table I just showed you tries to cover as many of them as we're able to quantitatively. Not all of them are easily quantified, as I think you know. Many of the goals are either absolute or ambiguous, or both. For instance, ending poverty in all its forms everywhere. What does that mean? Obviously, severe poverty is one thing we often focus on, but even severe poverty is a complicated thing to end it in all of its forms everywhere. I mean, can we really imagine a world where nobody's living on less than $1.90 a day or $2.10 a day? The World Bank generally uses less than 3% as more quantitative targets in their analyses, and we tend to use less than 3% or more than 97%, depending on the target, when we're looking at building graphics like the one I showed you. Building resilient infrastructure is a goal. What does that mean? We need, obviously, in a computer simulation, data-based, equation-based, we need specifics. And so sometimes we have to make judgments, and very often those judgments are potentially questionable. A lot of the targets, as I just said, don't have clear numerical values. In spite of that, in spite of these difficulties, this particular article that I'm referring to here looked out to 2030 and 2050, looked at the three scenarios that I've been talking about, the current path, which includes now a post-COVID world, or mostly post-COVID world, the prior world before COVID, the path we were on, and the SDG push, which is the combination of all those components I showed you, and talks about the global value in 2019, the number of countries meeting the target in 2019, and you'll see that obviously for each of those scenarios, which begin to change in 2019 or 2020, 102 countries out of that 188 met the target. It shows the global value, and actually the target we're talking about here is the extreme poverty in 2017 dollars, the most recent release of dollar values, and the poverty target, extreme poverty target for that is $2.15 a day. It shows that by 2030, we'll have increased the number of countries meeting the target. It shows a global value, and it goes out to, it shows the number of countries meeting the target, and the SDG push scenario down here. Keep doing this. The SDG push scenario down here means that 159 countries are estimated to have potential, and obviously all of this is crude. All of this is crude based upon equations, based upon data, our representation of that SDG push scenario, but 159 countries might meet that target in 2050. That is then obviously short of meeting that particular and extremely important SDG, even by the middle of the century. I think we probably all know already, those listening to this, that these goals will have to be renewed to look beyond their official 2030 termination or target level, target year now. They'll have to be renewed, they'll have to be reevaluated, there'll be changes made, just as there were from the Millennium Development Goals to the SDGs, but we might be able to get 159 countries to that extreme poverty 3% or less target with the SDG push. We can also look at the population suffering from malnutrition, and we might be able to get that to 164 countries by 2050. This particular diagram, I'm putting it up here because obviously it's important to be able to see paths across time, not just in particular years and tables. And here we see that a 320 target. By the way, we can set any poverty target we want for this model. It could be $5 or less as the poverty target. It could be $10 or less as the poverty target. So we're able to look at extreme, moderate, alternative poverty goals very easily. And this shows three lines with the base scenario showing this is the base scenario prior to introducing the no COVID world. I'm not saying this clearly. The important thing here is look at the SDG push scenario, which is in a COVID or post-COVID world, mostly post-COVID world, and we see the reduction on a global basis of the percentage of people living on less than 320 a day. It's important to us, particularly for looking at goals around education and health, to be able to look at this by age and sex. And this particular slide shows you obviously three representations. Upper left is the world in 2023, and it shows us by age and sex the number of percentage of total population that has, for those above 15 going upward, look at the 15 and 19 category. Very few of that in that category have obviously completed even secondary education globally, but significant numbers have completed primary education in the green bar there. But significant numbers in the red there haven't had no education or incomplete primary education. And that the distribution changes over time with people also in the older categories, significant numbers having secondary and then tertiary education. Over on the right-hand side of the upper part of this diagram, you see our forecast, and all of these are in what we're now calling the base case world, which is the world with post-COVID world, and it shows that by 2050, we've got a very different age sex distribution overall. We actually have something that looks a little bit like the U.S. Baby boom post in about the 1970s in the U.S. or other higher income countries. We see the post-World War II baby boom out there in the 30s and 40s, and it's quite a different world. But even then, in 2050, we're seeing that there are significant numbers in the 15 and 19 category who have not yet completed primary education, and very few in the 20 to 24 category who have not completed primary education, and significant numbers who have now completed secondary education. Down in the bottom of this figure is a possible world for 2100, and it's a very different world out there, obviously with a population distribution which is showing a decreasing population at the younger years and showing our education levels. So this is a useful tool to have a combined demographic model which actually represents population in single year categories using UN population division data primarily to initialize this, but showing the relationships among education and population, and also we're able to drill down into subcategories. This is the World Bank low income category, which is heavily represents Africa, by the way, and we could look at Africa or individual African countries with the same tool with a flip of the options in these specialized displays. But look at 2017, the low income countries on the left, and the very large number of people across all age and sex categories who have not yet completed primary education. This is, as has been suggested already today, a major target for moving towards an enhanced world, towards undertaking a great transition. On the right, we see the contrast with high-income countries, also basically contemporary 2017, and it's an incredibly different world. I mean, when we think about any of the SDGs, obviously we're talking globally, but the distinctions across countries and regions and income levels are incredibly important for us to take into account, to analyze. This turns to health. On the left-hand side, we see low-income countries, and our health model represents 17 different mortality categories, the primary ones in the global burden of disease work. The left brings those together into communicable, non-communicable disease categories and injuries and accidents. And obviously you see the significant infant mortality down there at the bottom, but you see also, as you move to the right, what the communicable disease breakdown is for the low-income countries in 2017. Our mental models obviously draw our eyes almost immediately to AIDS, which is significant, but it is categories like other communicable diseases. But look at diarrhea. Diarrhea is an important one here because water and sanitation are especially important contributors. Inadequate water, unsafe water, and unsafe sanitation are contributors in the model and in the real world, obviously, to that representation of diarrhea and diarrhea mortality. We don't ignore, obviously, I've been focused today on human development indicators primarily. We are also extremely interested in the climate change issue, and as all of the integrated assessment models are. And this shows us the CO2 parts per million in 3 different scenarios again. In current years, we're somewhat above 400 parts per million. Most of you know that it was about 280 parts per million pre-industrial. And the world in the base case, that's the path we seem to be on, again, in the mostly post-COVID world, is the blue line and would take us up to over 600 parts per million by the end of the century. Interestingly, and I'm going to get to this in a little bit more detail, the SDG push scenario actually raises the level of our forecast for CO2 parts per million above that by 2100. And that may seem counterintuitive to you, but think about the fact that our push scenario includes enhancement of health, increased population as a result of that, even though it also means somewhat lower fertility rates. It means also some improvements in economic productivity and economic growth, and those contribute potentially to higher emissions and the higher atmospheric CO2 level by the end of the century. The focus, the sub-focus within the SDG push scenario on climate, going back to that table I showed you earlier, which breaks down the SDG scenario in the different elements of the push. That push alone would hold us to about 550 if we weren't doing any of the other things in the SDG scenario, and actually begin a tiny little bit of decrease even by the end of the century. That brings me to this table, and we're moving towards wrap up here. But this table is showing you going back to the poverty issue again, and it's showing $3.10 in 2050 through 2050 in tabular form. And each column here is one of the elements of that SDG push scenario. And what you see, and I have to move, I can't see the far right here if I got everything up there. Okay. If you look at the far right here, the entire SDG push scenario would bring the number of people living on less than 310 from 1.8 billion people down to a little less than 500 million people by mid-century. And obviously, if we were looking at 215 for extreme poverty right now, we'd be bringing that down from a somewhat lower number to something beginning to approach with the SDG push, right? Basically, the ending of extreme poverty by mid-century. But look back here. This is the path we seem to be on, in contrast to this one with the entire SDG push. And we would end up with about 1 billion people still living under 310 a day. The health scenario by itself increases the number of people in the world, does improve infant mortality, obviously, reduces maternal mortality, reduces some of the other elements of mortality. We end up with a higher population, and we actually end up with slightly more people living under 310, even though they're healthier, and that health should contribute to improvement in income. And as has been emphasized already today, income is not the end all of what we're looking at here in this model, or we should be looking at in terms of an improved future. We should be looking at things across the entire range of human well-being. Education by itself, health by itself, access to water and sanitation, improved nutrition. We should be looking at improved governance, less corruption, more efficiency. We should be looking at a world in which we're having reforestation rather than continued deforestation. All of those elements, but if we focused on health only by itself, we would not necessarily be reducing the number of people in poverty. In fact, interestingly, each one of these thrusts by themselves has some impact on poverty, but not tremendous. It's the combination that really bring down the poverty the most and fully. But there are synergies and trade-offs, that the emphasis on not just an integrated scenario, but on the components that make up that scenario and analysis is really important. Now, I want to emphasize, I'm showing you numbers here. They're extremely precise, and they're all wrong. I'm going to say that again. They're all wrong. We are doing our darndest to forecast as well as we can with the most accurate data we can get, with the best formulations we can develop, and we're constantly doing this. We've been doing it now, as I said, for 50 odd years, but we can't simply accept these results. Computer models are thinking tools. The IF system was developed initially and distributed for the first 20 years of its existence as an educational tool only. It was only near the end of the century when we began to be approached by a group in the European Commission wanting us to be part of the fifth framework project to look at global change, and approached by the National Intelligence Council wanting us to help with the global trends reports that's presented to the president returning or ongoing every fourth year. And by the way, totally open to the public. These are not behind security walls, but we were approached and we began to move more into a policy analytical world. But we never used the word prediction in the International Futures Project. We always used the words scenarios. This is where we seem to be going. This is where we might be able to go. We have to take our mental models, our models developed prescriptively and analytically from all kinds of other sources, and the computers help think about those. I keep emphasizing that. International Futures has more cross-cutting connections across all these issue areas: economics, agriculture, health, education, all the others that I've mentioned, than any other tool I think of its kind, particularly in terms of representation geographically of countries. And for some country teams, we have broken it down into states or districts also. It's freely available to all, but it is not a prediction tool. It's a thinking tool. And at this point, I want to open it up for discussion. And I was going to stop sharing, but what more can I tell you about IFs and the SDGs? Might this be beneficial in your own work? And where can we go? I'm going to leave my video off, I think, because of the difficulties I was having before. I hope you can still hear me. And Anitra, are you going to pick it up, lead us into a conversation?
Hi, Barry. Thank you so much. We are going to have a discussion now where some of the voyageurs who have been working on positive future scenarios are going to tell in 2 or 3 sentences how they brought about a transformation, and then are going to ask you a question about your presentation now, as well as how you integrated things. We're very, very grateful for you having given us this presentation. And the first person will be John Gilmour from Cape Town, South Africa. John, you're on.
Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you, Barry, for once again just reminding us of how integration of all the ideas and all the systems is going to be so important for our little micro pieces to make any sense in the world. I work in South Africa. We have started a network of 8 small schools working in the most economically challenged areas of South Africa. And as you know, South Africa has the greatest Gini coefficient in the world. And so we are working really in the micro spaces of deep poverty. Our paradigm shift that we are leveraging is the personal change lies at the basis of all learning. It is in the mindset and the set of assumptions that we need to focus education. And we're basing our work a lot on the Black consciousness leadership of Steve Biko, who cautioned everybody and said, until we can find ways of liberating ourselves, we will never be free. Nobody can liberate us from outside, and so we have to liberate ourselves. And it is in that context that the work of LEAP invites young people to free themselves. We've worked for 20 years, and we've had over 3,000 graduates coming out of school, and 75% of those graduates have gone on to go to university. That's measured against a percentage from the same areas of between 1% and 5%. So our hypothesis testing wasn't, if you do more teaching, will children learn faster? It was putting the shift of emphasis onto the child to actually take charge of their own learning. And that's a key shift. And Barry, I'm grateful for, we've had some feedback from you using your model, which illustrated to us and was deeply encouraging that if this model can be integrated into a public school system in Africa, then there will be significant shift. And that was such an inspiration to us. So please know that modeling gave us the confidence to now open an institute where we are now working with public schools in South Africa and beyond to shift this. Barry, my question to you really is, in the work we're doing in the micro space, we understand that working in a boutique and trying to keep refining and improving has some value for just the people in the boutique. But all our work is really trying to open the voyagers, is trying to ask the question, what are the key levers for change? And what I'm interested in your modeling is how do you factor in accelerated change? We can't wait in Africa for incremental shift, as your models show us. And we have to actually ask the higher level question, is what accelerates it? And if we take Donella Meadows' view that it is personal change that is fundamental to all change, then that's where we want to accelerate the change. So any thoughts on that, particularly in terms of the African reality that you've now grappled with amongst all the other realities that you've synthesized?
Well, John, I mean, first of all, thank you for the earlier communications, interactions we've had, and the use of the International Future System to the degree that it can be helpful in what you're doing. In terms of your question, I don't have any easy answers, obviously. I mean, with respect to the model, representing an acceleration is fairly easy. Almost every significant policy leverage point that I've gone through, in very, very general terms, has additive and multiplier scenario variables. So we can say, okay, let's spend more here. Let's focus more on STEM. Let's advance sanitation, improvement. So we put those multipliers and additive factors in, and as I said, we try to make it so that we're not just giving a free lunch, that it has to come from someplace, and we have to represent that as well. But the reality is, in the real world, it's all of us who are doing little things. I mean, in Denver, when I work with the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless, that's the leverage point that I have, or one of them. And the model can be useful, but it is always going to be more aggregate. It's always going to be, it maybe tells us some of the places that are especially important. And I happen to think that homelessness in this country, and water and sanitation access, and across Africa, these are really, and education obviously are fundamentally essential. And we can say something with the model about maybe what the return will be to those additive and multiplicative pushes. But at best, they're kind of guesstimates. When you work with these kinds of models for half a century, as much about their weaknesses as their strengths, and I don't like to oversell. I like to say we can make some contributions, but in terms of changing the world, it'll be the individual things we do, and guided to some degree by insights that we might use in this learning tool.
Well, if I could just say, the snapshot that your model produced, just in our very micro space, was such a valuable affirmation. So even just the model as an affirmation tool of what can be done and what leveraging can look like, I'm very grateful for that. I sense from your response too that you're saying it's not diagnostic in its capacity, but it does give you the snapshot, which then puts the responsibility onto us to think about how to accelerate that leverage. So thank you, Barry. Much appreciated.
Well, and John, thank you for
very
using
much.
it, but also for that acceleration that you're undertaking.
Thank you.
We thank you for making other people who are unused to futures, visions increased by looking at your model, because your models have such clarity that somebody from the business community or somebody from some other philanthropic community can look at the model and instantly see the difference between business as usual and if transformations were done and the SDGs were pushed. So thank you for the clarity of your model. Next, we want to ask David Pollock from the Canadian Club of Rome, who's a past president there, to say what he has done on integrated futures for a province, and then ask Barry a question. Go ahead, David.
So this goes back to our Voyageur work, where I did a presentation that I'll summarize very, very quickly. When I wanted to theme it as well-being and survival, new wine for old, let me just close this part of the screen. New wine for old wineskins. And the reason I wanted to do that is because we have one planet Earth, and we really, when we talk about well-being, I didn't want people to think that we were forgetting about the multiple crises that we face. So I actually saw that we were doing work as voyageurs in 4 quadrants. One had to do with our energy systems. One has to do with the need for restorative ecological measures. In the new wine, it's the work on well-being that we've been hearing today. And as a subset of that, it's the kind of transformative education work which John has been doing. Now, my particular work goes back to the kind of thing that Bob was talking about earlier, when we did early work in one province, the oil province of Canada, Alberta, trying to get tools for policymakers that got out from under what the Premier was calling the Alberta Advantage, showing how well we were doing with all the fossil fuel that was being produced. So we drilled down to this notion of measuring what citizens value and try to make it visible to all to create economies of well-being. One of the core challenges, however, is in living in an individualistic society. Sometimes in the short term, what's best for you as an individual, as a shareholder, as a CEO, may not be best for all. So this philosophic challenge of moving toward values that look at the common good that we've been talking about today seem front and center. I also share this slide because it amuses me that we used to have an outdated CACOR, Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, where we had expropriated Alaska. We've now since fixed that piece. You'll recall, of course, earlier that we all now well know that GDP is not dealing with the things that are most important. And that quote goes back to Robert Kennedy in '68 about measuring everything except what makes life worthwhile. Now, Robert earlier was saying that GDP was never intended to measure well-being, but the problem is that economists, journalists, the general public, policymakers themselves, we find, use it very frequently as almost an absolute of well-being. So we wanted to ask the question about what is really sustainable in terms of the province of Alberta, what kind of foundation. So we drew from 51 economic indicators, social indicators, and environmental to create the Alberta Genuine Progress Indicator. There's 51 because we had data for them. And the interesting thing here is the green is environmental, the blue social, and the red economic. In this model going from 1960 to 1999, in this particular slide, imagine that the entire circle was filled out. That would show a highly positive province in terms of all of these well-being indicators. Comparatively, you can see, for example, this problem gambling was the worst in 1999 and the best in 1960, or the least amount of problems from gambling addiction. And so when you go through those indicators, the challenge, of course, as a matrix is you can't really come up very easily with one figure like GDP. And we found indeed that from a regional basis, it was probably better for policymakers to take a look and then pick out sort of this particular policy areas that seem to be not doing well. This gives you an overview of what happened from 81 to 2008, where you can see the crisscross of gross domestic product with the GPI indicator and the great gap between them.
Thank you.
The next work that we did, and the last thing that I'll say is, a lot of this work is now being done in small communities. This is an Indigenous community in Canada where the participants pick up their factors that are most important to them, and you'll see very many of the well-being ones are related to relationships. So I'll just that's for further discussion later. So really, the essential thing we were doing was trying to measure what citizens value and make it visible to all to create economies of well-being. And my question for you, we can stop screen. My question really is, I was quite taken, Barry, when you indicated that you might do better in the education metric, but it would actually perhaps move up to 600 parts per million of CO2. And my question really is, if that kind of thing happens, what assumptions are in the model, if any, about what happens to societies with increasing drought and shortage of food and more wars and huge migration and huge flooding? Could that not blow out almost entirely the progress that was projected in the indicator the way you had it outlined? So just a comment on that, please.
There is no question that there would be negative effects in the world and actually also in the model as the CO2 rises and the temperatures change. I mean, we have a representation of the forward linkages between carbon dioxide, atmospheric and temperatures around the world, and those temperature impacts also vary geographically, as you know, with greater changes in higher latitudes. Near the poles, the temperature changes exacerbated relative to that near the equator, and those temperature changes could be positive and negative. I mean, the impact on agricultural productivity in some northern latitudes might actually be positive as a result of temperature rise, but on the whole, that will be negative with respect to our representation in the agricultural model. We don't have an explicit representation of ocean rise and coastal flooding and the damages that would give rise to. I wish we did, but we don't. So our forward linkages representation in the climate change impact area are not as great as they should be. As I said, there is some with respect to agriculture productivity, but not with respect to the coastal impacts. I wish there were more.
No,
Does that answer you to some degree?
yes, it does. Thank you. Yeah.
We can't hear you. You're on mute.
I've stopped talking. I thought the moderator was going to pick up again, Marilyn.
Yeah, I can't hear her. She's talking that.
Oh, her.
Yeah, sorry, we're unmuted now.
Sorry, we're having a lot of problems at this end with the management.
Sorry, Marilyn. You're talking to me.
We have to leave here shortly, evidently. We didn't know
Let me,
that.
while you're
Marilyn
working.
Marilyn is going to talk for 2 minutes about her transformation that she's undertaken and done, and then she's going to ask Barry a question. Marilyn?
Yes, well, first of all, Barry, I want to thank you for your previous support when we created some models of Afghanistan education. Those models are now completely they're not useful for us at this point, but I do appreciate the work you did and the hope we had at that moment. And so we're Educate Girls Now has been in action since 2013, but we are continually reinventing ourselves due to the changes in Afghanistan. And so our focus has moved from empowerment on mothers to ensure girls are not married at a young age to numeracy and literacy. And we're doing that in ways that are breaking the models of the past, which is what we call school on a phone. So we have our girls now learning at home using their cell phones, which before the Taliban came was completely not allowed. Girls were considered bad girls for doing that. So we're really in a very young stage of how do we have a breakthrough in not only literacy and numeracy, but in well-being. And what we're seeing movement, we're seeing enthusiasm. Every girl who's in our program, of which we have 159, is taking a course or two, whether through our phone school or actually going to a small afternoon care center. And we're seeing a literacy rate that's growing in terms of English and as a second language, which has become very important. We just recently finished a program with the Finnish Lifelong Learning Program. We taught a course for 3 months to over 100 girls. And the feedback we got, the summaries we received weekly were phenomenal. The joy that those girls experienced through education in terms of enhancing their well-being was truly inspiring. And we hope that UNESCO will fund that again. So we're focusing on generating new ways for girls to learn. And in a country that's changing on a daily basis and where there's great concern, it's truly been a challenge. But I can tell you that in this small micro space, what we've discovered that education is a key lever to well-being. And we continue to use that. We're seeing a trend now of young girls, ages 14, leaving Afghanistan with our help to go attend school in the US. And other girls go to Afghanistan universities outside of Afghanistan. And those that are staying are all doing a course of some sort, usually English, art, and writing. We also work on trauma therapy, and our goal is to enhance girls' well-being. And this is so new that we hope that what we're seeing is going to continue to grow.
Thank
So-
you, Marilyn.
If I can pick up that, I didn't really hear a question.
You're
but-
gonna
but I-
have to go.
Yeah, okay, I'll be.
Go ahead, Barry.
I was going to say, I didn't really hear a question there, but I agree. First of all, I want to tell you how much I appreciate. I'm going to comment on the kind of things that Marilyn is continuing to do in places like Afghanistan, in spite of the difficulty. My wife, Janet Dixon, is a board member on a small nonprofit called Friends of Gayoul, which helps people in Gayoul, Senegal. Helps girls and their families complete education. And they, having been in operation now for a bit more than 10 years, I think, doing this, have increased the high school graduation rate, secondary graduation rate, up to 38% in a country where it's 1% more generally. It may seem small, but it's incredibly important for those people.
It really is. And I want to say that as I was listening to John Gilmour, who I greatly appreciate, my hope is that our model will keep growing so that more and more girls are being educated in Afghanistan, in a country where it seems like it's impossible to move ahead. But when you have the human will and the human desire to do something, it can really transform lives. And that's what we're seeing. The determination is phenomenal. So I commend the work that your wife is doing, and 38% means a lot.
Thank you. Ted?
Okay.
Okay,
away.
Ted Manning, who's the president of the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, will give us a quick 2 minutes on his transformations in tourism around the world. And then he'll ask Barry a question or two.
Well, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to very quickly go through this particular notion of what we are really trying to do to foster well-being within the Club of Rome. The whole idea is that we started this several years ago, and it reflects a lot of the stuff that people today have been presenting. Sort of how can we get here? Are our assumptions wrong? Yes, they are. Growth, greed, all of that. Really, how do we actually get this way? And why were we always programmed to want it all, want it now, want more, and don't talk to me if you're not giving it to me? And besides, I really do not want to be taxed because that's greed. The problem is we've programmed ourselves to try and ask for more than is possible, ignore completely the constraints and the limits. In fact, the limits to growth are something most people have never heard of, and when you tell them it's considered to be unpopular. Our real challenge has been, and I'm just doing this over very quickly to show you the kind of thing we're going to try and bring up in Brussels this fall, to try and have more of a discussion specifically on the challenge of how you actually counter the lack of well-being and the focus we have on growth. The real issue is really is that to try and focus on how humans and their biosphere can be more successful, and what we have to do to change our behaviors, because the problem is really us. We do know that, I mentioned this earlier, that we have a lot of empirical studies around the world from over 50 communities, identifying exactly what the real people, when you talk to them, say they want in life. And amazingly, growth is virtually not on the list. It barely makes it anywhere. It really has nothing to do with the things important to people: survival, health, nutrition, freedom of speech, freedom from fear, all of these things. They show up, and we have literally dozens of studies showing exactly how real people see as their key values. We just don't offer them the opportunity to focus on them. Real desires for people tend to fall into the idea of survival, health, community, can all work together to share, creating something that's all of value to us. In fact, that's how most people define well-being. Well-being to them is not dying with the most bucks in the bank, as David Gorton did on a book he did, simply saying you can't eat money. That's really one of the things that got us going thinking about this, saying, well, if you can't eat money, what can't you eat? What do you want? Or what would make a lifestyle that's worth having? So to sort of end this, the real desires, outcomes of our future and of this entire program that we're trying to do in terms of well-being is enhancing human habitation of an intact Earth ecosystem, identifying best practice from a whole range of people, not just economists, not just financiers, educators, ecologists, medics, people seriously interested in values such as justice, equity, and so forth, and who work together to create a common vision for Earth's peoples. The whole idea of this project is to create a global networking alliance that will try to do this. Several of the presentations you've heard so far today are components of just that. They are building blocks to a sustainable future for all of us and well-being that everybody can buy into. So thank you for my 3 minutes, and I don't want to prolong time anymore.
We want to, Barry, do you have remarks about that?
Well, one thing, let me pick up, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll tie this back also to the earlier conversation of collective good versus individual action and individual interests, because this common vision is really important. I mean, obviously, first of all, let me say, clear back in graduate school, I read a book by Mansur Olson, an economist who was at Maryland, I believe, Logic of Collective Action. And it really made an impression on me, because there is so much out there where individual self-interest and collective well-being conflict. And a major step in terms of reconciling individual action and individual interest with collective well-being is that common vision that you were just talking about. I mean, if people don't understand that somehow or other their individual action is affecting the common situation negatively, they'll never take the action. I mean, we'll all pursue our individual self-interests. We have to help people through education, through individual conversations with people in our daily lives. We have to help people understand that individual interests and collective action collective good can be in conflict. At the same time, we have to understand that until people are at a certain level, they have nutrition, they have some level of income and well-being, that even if they understand the conflict between their self-interest and the common good, nothing's going to happen. They're going to have to pursue their self-interest logically. So we have a really complex conflict between individual interest and individual understanding and that common vision and common good. So thanks for coming back to that.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated your presentation. That's the fodder for us to begin to work on.
we want to thank everybody who made this possible this afternoon, as well as this morning, Dr. Ryan Jackson and Ted Manning, who were the IT people here, even though that's in no way their métier, and Marilyn Mosley-Gordanier and the USA Club of Rome, as well as cooperation with the Canadian Club of Rome, and very particularly, as well as Bob Costanza and David Pollock, Marilyn, John Gilmour. And thank you all. And we hope that this action session has gone not unnoticed in the many action sessions that are here at the summit. We feel very encouraged that the Secretary General and all his staff are thinking about the summit and about the future, and that this has finally become something important to look at the Sustainable Development Goals in terms of, can we really make them, or can we not make them? Can we make them with big pushes?